Good afternoon. It's been a little busy time in Washington the last few hours. The next 2 weeks are about immigration and how reforming a broken system has become a political goal of the faith community, and why that is and why we are being successful is going to be our topic. However, first of all, last night the government shut down. Why this is relevant to our topic is the coordinator of the immigration table that we work from called me yesterday and said, what are we going to do? I mean, we won the August recess. I'll say more about that in terms of politics in the country for immigration. We've won public opinion. We're winning Republicans and Democrats to the issue. And if a vote were taken on immigration reform, we win now. But the threat is a vote won't be taken. Why? Because of the dysfunction of Washington, D.C. The political dysfunction here could put everything else off the table, including immigration reform, which is pretty extraordinary. So when Washington ever calculates that there are 11 million undocumented families whose very lives are at stake, and the dysfunction of Washington pays no attention. This town doesn't govern anymore, it just fights. So winning has replaced governing, and I would say ideology has replaced the common good. So let's start there. And then we'll move to why immigration could be a case study of how to do this right, actually. But where we are is a different place. So yesterday morning, we had a press conference of fake leaders about this shutdown idea. And you had the head of many organizations and a number of us on the call. And David Beckman, Bread for the World, said risking our nation's credit worthiness will do more damage. Most clearly, the disruption and uncertainty will put brakes on our economy. All that's true. Here's what I said. The problem with the government shutdown is not merely political. That the art of compromise has disappeared in Washington, D.C., which is true. That's a problem, okay? But the problem is more deeply theological. Let me explain that. The extreme elements that are pushing to shut down the government are not just against both Republican and Democratic traditions of governing. In other words, I know Republicans who are really upset about this because they believe in government. They believe in governing. They might want a smaller government, a more limited government, but they believe in government and governing. But a small minority here of, I would call them, political extremists, ideological extremists, are against government per se. They are hostile to the role of government. And that is a biblical problem, I'm suggesting. So the Bible sees the role of government as to protect from evil, promote the good. Romans 13, the Apostle Paul lays it out in the 13th chapter of Romans. Protect from evil, violence, insecurity, promote the good, what we call the common good. And the prophets make clear, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, the Psalms say this, the book of Kings says this, that kings and rulers, governments, are to protect and help the poor. That's biblical, it's scriptural, it's in the text. So these people are against that. They are against the role of government per se, which I'm suggesting is And this is only appropriate for those who claim to be Christians and who are saying this. They say they're Christians or they're Jewish or they're people of faith, and yet they're taking a position which their scriptures do not support. They're against government per se, and here's where it gets ugly. Because government has a responsibility to protect the poor, these ideological zealots also are hostile to the poor. Their hostility toward government extends to the people government is supposed to protect. So they blame them for their poverty, and they claim it's their own fault. And I'll just say a third point that every person of color on the Hill feels this, but none of them can say it. So I'll say it. Race is involved here. Race is involved here. Because they say that poor people are mostly people of color. That's not true, but that's what they say, and they imply all the time. Poor people are people of color, and they're really still mad about a president who is the first president of color, and they're mad about that. Now, you can disagree with Barack Obama and not be a racist. I disagree with Barack Obama on Syria, on Afghanistan. Disagreeing is a good thing. And most people up there, Republicans who just disagree, they disagree. But there's a group, the birthers and all these folks who've been attacking him from the start about whether he's a real American, whether he was born here, whether he really is one of us. And that's a part of this too. So, so we say in this letter we put out yesterday, our democracy rests on principles of reason, compromise, and a commitment to the common good. To hold our governance processes and financial credibility hostage to narrow priorities is not only dangerous to the nation's near-term financial being, it threatens the very foundations of the democratic process and our capacity to live with it. So this was Simone Campbell from Network was there, Catholic Sister, heads of denominations, Rabbi David Saperstein was there, Saeed Said from the Islamic Society of North America. A number of us were there. This was an interfaith conference, and I'm really suggesting that there is a theological dimension to this. It isn't just politics. Now, I didn't suggest this chapter from my latest book for your readings because I didn't know this would come up. If I had known it, it was being threatened, but I didn't. I thought they'd avoid it. I'm not sure I thought. I was hoping they'd avoid it. But it turns out the publisher just told me they're putting out a mini book with this chapter, and so this is not required reading, and it's not, you won't be quizzed on it, but as you think through these questions, which we will be now for days or weeks or months, I wanted to give you some things to think about, some resources to think about these questions. And actually, given what's going on, this might be a good topic for a paper. You know, what is the role of government theologically in all of our traditions? The guy who just came in, works here, very smart guy. We've been together on this table. He's politically much more conservative than I am on a number of things, but he's incredulous at what's happening on the Hill. It isn't a conservative liberal thing or a Democrat Republican. It's really whether there's a role for government that's necessary in human society. Catholic social teaching, their letter went out yesterday, and they said this is not acceptable. The bishops are concerned about what the government's doing at a number of levels. They disagree a number of things, but they say this is not the way to solve this. The way to resolve this is you got budgets. You have a Republican budget, Democratic budget. You make conference. You talk about. You compromise. We're not doing that. We're shutting down the government over an objection to the Affordable Care Act. So let me just share some of this with you, just for your own thinking, to help process this in these next few days, because it relates directly to immigration and all the rest. So let's start with this question of the role of government. So there's a section here just called "To Protect and Promote." I'm going to read a couple things from it. The purpose of government, according to Paul, Apostle Paul, is to protect its people from the chaos of evil and to promote the good of the society. To protect and promote. To protect and promote. That's how I see it. Preserving the social order, punishing evil and rewarding good, and protecting the common good are all prescribed by this text. And we're even instructed to pay taxes for those purposes. It says you pay taxes. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and to God that which is God's. So first, government is to protect its people. That certainly means protecting its citizens' safety and security. We all see what happens when there's a natural disaster and there's when chaos breaks out. Humankind, human nature being what it is, some people will take advantage of that and will even use violence for self-aggrandizement. You need to protect the people, their security, their safety from evil, from violence, from selfishness. Very important. Secondly, governments are also need to protect their people judicially and make sure our legal and court systems are procedurally just and fair. Now, the biblical prophets in a regular way rail against corrupt court decisions and systems in which the wealthy and powerful manipulate the legal process to serve themselves and always disadvantage the poor and vulnerable. The prophets say that over and over again. So Prophet Amos says, hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts, says Amos. So along with protecting, government should promote the good, protect from evil, and Romans says promote the good, what we call now the common good. This letter from the bishops yesterday said that to every member of Congress. Your job is to promote and protect the common good. Now the prophets in particular say governmental authority is to protect the poor in particular and promote their well-being. Okay? The prophets are consistent and adamant in their condemnation to kings and rulers of injustice to the poor and require the king, the government, to act justly. Now, this expectation did not just apply to kings in Israel. They applied this to kings in neighboring countries. This wasn't just to Jewish kings and rulers. This was to kings and rulers, whoever they were, whether they were part of the people of God or not. This is an accountability to kings and rulers. So, Jeremiah, speaking of King Josiah, says, he defended the cause of the poor and needy, so all went well. The next line is revealing. Is that not what it means to know me? Says Jeremiah. Or Solomon, of him the scriptures say, through the words of the Queen of Sheba, because the Lord loved Israel forever, he has made you king to execute justice and righteousness. That's in 1 Kings. Psalm 72 says, give the king your justice, O God, and your righteousness to a king's son. May he judge your people with righteousness and your poor with justice. And I want to recommend, for those who want to go deeper into this, a book by Ron Sider called Fixing the Moral Deficit. Now here's what Ron says. This is worth paying attention to. The biblical understanding of justice clearly includes both procedural and distributive aspects. Procedural and distributive. That the procedures must be fair is clear in the several texts that demand unbiased courts. Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. But the distributive justice, fair outcomes, Ron says, fair outcomes, is also a central part of justice, evident not just from the hundreds of texts. Remember I told you last week or 2 weeks ago, the Bible we took all the poor passages out. That's true. But in particular, it says, in the meaning of the key Hebrew words for justice, mishpat and tzedakah, the two Hebrew words for justice, okay? The prophets use those words time and time again to refer to fair economic outcomes. Fair economic outcomes. So, after denouncing Israel and Judah for the absence of justice, prophet Isaiah condemns the way the rich and powerful landowners have acquired all the land by pushing out small farmers. Isaiah 5:7-9. It's important to see that this text does not say the powerful acted illegally, they were acting legally, but nevertheless denounces the unfair outcome. In another Isaiah text, the prophet denounces the powerful who use, quote, unjust laws to, quote, deprive the poor of their rights. Use unjust laws to deny the poor of their rights. There's Isaiah 10, there's a version of that that we used once in the vigil at the Capitol after a budget debate when the poor were just completely shut out of the process. And it says, woe to you legislators. That's a great phrase to use in the Capitol of the U.S. Rotunda, which is where we said it. Woe to you legislators who deny the poor among my people of their rights. 100 of us said that, and we were arrested that day at the U.S. Capitol for quoting Isaiah 10. The prophets teach that justice includes fair economic outcomes, not just fair procedures. Very important. Outcomes, not just procedures. Now, Sider says fair outcomes. He doesn't say equal outcomes. Very different. Okay? Now, the right will continue to say that people who talk like I'm talking today, and Ron Sider does, want to hold government accountable for justice, are asking equal outcomes from public policy. That's not true. Not equal outcomes, but fair outcomes. And it is true that historical attempts by Marxist governments to create equal outcomes have dramatically shown this has great danger. And it often turns around and makes things sometimes even worse. So we're not saying equal outcomes, we're saying fair outcomes. So procedurally and distributively, governments should deal with this. Now, this is really the problem that some of our extremists have with the rule of government. When you burn down the house, I've heard that phrase now for 24 hours, they want to burn down the house, right? What you're left with is a society that no one's governing and a marketplace that makes all the rules. A marketplace that makes all the rules with no protections, no regulations, which is what they hate. Regulations, protections of people from the market. So we're in a very difficult situation, and I wanted to bring this here so we can, I'd love to know what you all think about this so we can discuss this. I'd be curious to know when we get to the discussion. In fact, I think I'm going to stop here and see. Do most Georgetown students know this happened last night, do you think? Yeah? Okay. Yeah. Right? Has there been much talk about it? Yeah? Yeah. So tell me what you're thinking or what your colleagues are thinking about this. What's the sort of conversation about this? Because this is directly relevant to our topic, faith in politics. And as I predicted from day one, we did lots of wrong things to talk about it. Here we go. So, your thoughts on that? Yeah.
Cool. Something that's really interesting, and I'm sure you guys have all seen this, but the minute you go on Facebook or in social media, everyone has something posted about it. And it seems like a lot of people are taking different approaches where some are straight up blaming Republicans, some are saying that it's just dysfunctional Washington, others are posting things like BuzzFeed articles or pickup lines that are based off of the shutdown. And so it's interesting to see that different people really have different approaches. And I don't know if it's simply because they have a different level of interest in government. But what is interesting is that it does seem to affect everyone. And everyone does seem to realize that this is a significant problem for a variety of reasons.
Okay. Good, good. What else?
It's amazing to me that the few who are forcing the shutdown aren't thinking through the long-term consequences of the action. And maybe they have, but not from my vantage, not my standpoint. And just the financial implications. I know they're upset about the cost of Obamacare and want to delay it a year and change things to try and keep the costs down and not impose government on people. But in listening to some of the congressmen on the news the other night, and they say they're doing this for their constituents. And all I can think of is, you're going to pay, your constituents are going to end up paying for this. In more ways than we can even imagine right now. I think it's really going to create major problems.
A quote that I've been seeing on Facebook that I pulled up is, "This is all about staffing a law that increases taxes on rich people and reduces subsidies to private insurance and Medicare in order to help low-income Americans buy health insurance. That's it. That's why the Republican Party might shut down the government and default on the debt." So that's from a Washington Post article that I think a lot of people are very upset that it's coming down to the Affordable Health Care Act that has been passed and just kind of going back and stuffing everything because of that, and especially going down to why, yes, it's not a perfect act, but why is there value in that? I think is a big frustration. I think a lot of students are also concerned about the upcoming debt ceiling vote because if this continues, I think that's what is the scariest thing. And I think another thing that isn't being talked about enough is the impact it has on the District of Columbia where we go to school. I think a lot of people are kind of focusing on, oh, it's messing up the travel plans if you travel to the Smithsonian, but it really will have an impact. It's about $200 million a day that DC is going to lose, like trash collection, the city shutting down. It really has an impact on DC citizens who don't even have a vote in Congress. So I think taxation without representation really hits hard for people living in DC right now.
Do most people understand what the debt ceiling crisis how this could flow into that? Are people talking about that too? That's a couple weeks away, and that would cause the default of the U.S. government, which really begins to hit the economy and the markets and all that. Because these issues are not tied together. We're not sure how one will resolve itself. The other one is right before us. So yeah, please.
I really just see this event as like a culmination of what everyone has been like worried about with Congress and talking about with Congress for so long, which is the inability for them to get anything done in the gridlock, and it's just kind of like become such a heightened thing now in such a horrible sense. Like literally shutting the government down is probably the worst thing that they could do. I don't know, coming from a conservative standpoint, I'm personally not a fan of Obamacare for a lot of reasons. There are things that I love and things that I hate. But would I, as a constituent, want my Republican representative to, cause this like vote and shut down the government? No. I mean, I think that's being incredibly selfish and it's just stupid in general. I mean, there's really no other word for it other than that. But I mean, if there are issues with Obamacare, and we can see how that plays out and fix things later. But to shut down the government now and to make this big kind of temper tantrum, toddler-like act, I think it also makes our country just kind of look like a joke. From a foreign perspective. I mean, how does this cause, what kind of perception and, what kind of effect does this have on our, foreign policy and, global affairs and that kind of thing?
Yeah.
So I guess what concerns me is back in history, so right before we went into World War II, I can't think of what we were about to pass, but the government was just about to pass this huge bill, and it's going to change the lives of millions of Americans, and then Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and then that never ended up coming into fruition. So I almost see this as like that one big event that shifts our focus from something that we could have almost done. And so like you were saying in your introduction, how we have enough immigration support or immigration policy support in Congress that we could pass an immigration bill. And right now, we can't. This is our event that's shifting our viewpoint on something that should be way more important. Right now, we're just stuck in like cosmetic issues and like what we should be focusing on, like cutting and trimming down for budget. But there are so many bigger fish to fry that I'm just afraid that we're not going to be able to get to those because of the fact that we just can't agree in government.
And that's true of a lot of issues.
Yeah, it's not just immigration for
But
sure.
immigration is one that really could have passed.
Yeah.
And still made this fall, because everything else is, and we'll get into that in a few moments, things have come together in a way, I think, more than I even hoped. When we began our table 2 years ago on this issue, and yet it's utterly, a totally unrelated government dysfunction that is shutting down something that they could do together and positively and bipartisan. People are voting against each other on other things would have voted with each other on immigration. And if that prevents that from happening, it's a real tragedy for those families, but also for our political process. Yeah, please.
I work for the Democratic Party, so I'm totally biased. But in
But
speaking,
we have different points of view.
yeah, I'm diehard liberal.
This is good.
But I've been talking to my friends, my conservative friends, they're all just kind of like you said, your friend was just incredulous. And I think this is the first time in history we've seen such a small majority of Congress, like, kind of control what's going on. I mean, you have McCain out there and the other senior senators saying this isn't the way to go about it. But somehow this small group of Tea Partiers are just not willing to give in. So it's just kind of, it's just crazy.
So let's look at for a moment why that is. Why? Why are they not? Why Boehner is not? They've captured him.
Mm-hmm.
So why have they captured him, and why are people afraid?
I mean, I think he wants to hold. I mean, his position as House Speaker has been pretty tenuous. He hasn't really been able to control House Republicans for a while now. So I think this is kind of his only way of. I mean, it's a lose-lose situation for him. Like whether he, you know, he's going to get in trouble. But I think a lot of with what we talked about in office and stuff is with Ted Cruz 2016. He's looking at right. And in primaries, it's mostly the extra kind of extreme conservatives that vote.
Turn out for primaries.
Yeah, so I mean, in this instance, he is really looking at his constituents that he represents that do support him in that. But it's such a small minority compared to the.
And many of those who are pushing this come from gerrymandered districts where they have no threat to themselves. They won't pay for this in their districts. They will win again. And what they're threatening their colleagues with on the Republican side is that they'll be primaried, which is now a verb, primaried, because as you say, the people who tend to come out, like the Colorado recall vote that turned out those who voted for gun control, that's seen as a national change of heart. It's not. 13% was the turnout in Colorado. 13% of the people came out, but the ones who felt strongly about this came out and voted out these people. So they're worried about being, Frank Wolf in Virginia is worried about being primary in Northern Virginia. He actually voted with us on food stamps. We talked about it, and he finally did vote with us. But he's worried about being primary in Northern Virginia. So imagine if you're in many other states that are red states, and you're afraid of being primary. So there's tremendous fear. They don't. If a clean bill was put up, most Republicans, not just most members of Congress, most Republicans would vote for it. The polling shows that, but they're afraid to. So fear is dominating the process.
I think the sad thing is like we're talking about elections so far in the future,
Right.
and it's screwing up like our
Yeah.
present. You know, like how is something in 2016 going to be affecting now?
Some more hands.
Well, I thought your point before was really interesting because I hadn't thought about the religious aspect
Right.
of where some of the politicians are coming from. I was thinking that they're just not here in Washington enough.
Yeah.
They're not socializing with their fellow politicians and getting to know one another on a different level so that they can work collaboratively. But if they're against government, you know, it's a very hard place to move them from that point forward and get them to a point where they can even consider working collaboratively.
It's a philosophical issue politically and also religiously. So I'm looking at a deeper level than just who's to blame. Right now, the big issue in D.C. is who will pay for this, and a lot of Republicans are against this. They're against it because they think their party will pay most for it, will be hurt most for it, so they're against it. But who wins and who loses, there's got to be a deeper concern here against. It's just winning becomes everything now. Winning has replaced governing in Washington. And even in the coverage of things, it's winning and not governing. So that's where we are, which is a real common good threat here. You had your hand up?
Yeah, well, I suppose it was just kind of pulling off a lot of people have said. What just continually strikes me about this, whether you're looking at the politician's viewpoint or the reaction to it as well, but everything is very tunnel-minded, and it is very focusing in on one issue. And the budget considerations are such a complex thing. And I don't mean that in terms of numbers, but in terms of weighing one good against another.
Issues of austerity, scarcity, what do you choose, trade-offs.
It's not a black or white issue. And I mean, I don't agree with what Ted Cruz is doing personally or did personally. But without a doubt, he had an opinion and he voiced it, and the extent to which he took it, clearly, I mean, you can take the argument either way, but I don't view it as productive. And to look, but at the same point, that was a man vocalizing his views and getting, trying to argue for what he believed was right. And so it's hard to look at him and say, you are acting morally wrong for doing what you believe is right. And so I suppose just the sum total of this is that it just seems so tunnel-minded to label this as like a black or white issue.
I'd be curious to know, how does this, on a more personal level, how does this make you feel about your future? As younger people who are now engaging these issues as part of your life, how do you feel about the future here?
Well, I have to say it kind of depresses me because we think, in terms of our political culture, I think our generation is going to have to do a lot to try and restore, or try and bridge the chasm that is starting to define our political life. Because if not, I think we'll just end up devouring ourselves.
I think that because our generation has watched all of this unfold, it's almost like when you watch a train wreck, you're less likely to do it yourselves, hopefully. I mean, at least I think that we all have this kind of perspective on watching this happen and watching all, and actually being in college during it to process and analyze and think about all of these things. At least at Georgetown, I feel like we are constantly doing that, no matter what your major is. So I think that, I guess it gives me hope, thinking that, we've seen this happen. We've seen, hopefully, the worst of Congress gridlock and poor leadership and that kind of thing. So, perhaps that will just kind of incite people to want to do something about it when they become of the age to do so.
Let's go around. Number hands, you're great.
My initial reaction was like, all right, well, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to peace out of this country. But then I realized that the best way I was going to do that was through the Fulbright, which is actually like sponsored by the government. It was like a reality check in that like I'm actually more tied to this issue than I thought that I really was, and so probably the same is true for the rest of my generation in that like when I don't feel at least very attached to the government. I watched a lot of crazy stuff happen, as most of us have ever since like 9/11 really, but we are still intimately affected by it, regardless of the fact that we live in DC, but even so, we still very closely relate.
Similar to that, my Wilson High School son, he's a sophomore, he had an assignment to go to a museum, and I think he had to look at some different works of art and write an essay about them for his, and he had to rush and do it yesterday because after last night he wouldn't be able to go, you know. So he's trying to figure, it was a very practical thing he had to do, and he figured he had to do it yesterday or else he's going to be in trouble. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, kind of responding again to my initial reaction,
Yeah.
I think that it just makes me extremely kind of nervous for our generation, because seeing what, you know, everything that's been going on, I know that it will be up to our generation. We're going to be left with all of these pieces, and we're going to be the ones that will have to eventually build the government kind of back up. And I hope that, you know, we can learn from all the mistakes, and that hopefully, you know, when, you know, people our age, you know, eventually are elected and are serving in DC, that, you know, they'll learn from the mistakes and be able to build up kind of a better system of government.
Yeah. Great, yeah.
Sorry to bring that. There was a quote that I was looking to find again, and I can't find, but something that just, I guess, looking forward to the future is almost how overwhelming this problem is.
Yeah.
And there was a quote, and I don't remember what it specifically was, but essentially it was getting at the notion that no matter what approach the next generation takes at these issues, something different needs to be done. And the idea is that there could almost be two ways that goes. One, people move towards a middle ground, or you see a complete division towards these two polar opposite ends of the spectrum, resulting in even more of a schism and less productivity. And the quote itself was kind of making the argument that we're most likely to see that more of a schism. But in general, I think that just looking at the issue, and kind of what Kendall was saying, that you really don't want to repeat that. It's just such an overwhelming issue.
One issue is the polarization. The other, though, I would call it civility. Just a lack of civility. I mean, you could have very different points of view on a number of things, but how you talk about things, how you relate to each other, your sense of respect for each other, even in disagreement, becomes, and we've lost any notion of civility here.
Just on that, well, especially it's pertinent with this specific instance, because you've got people who are opposing, you know, this one bill. They're, you know, it's Obamacare, and that's their biggest complaint. The reasons why they're not allowing this to go through, and you're not realizing that in doing that, you're stopping up all of these other problems. And it really is. I mean, to say it's incivil, it really it's what it is, because it's just a complete lack of consideration for everything outside of your own priorities.
I wrote a column last week for HuffPost on how the Pope's statements, we talked a little bit here last week, how they really relate to what's going on. And the one that struck me most was his comments on public service, which he just made a few weeks ago. If you're a man or woman who wants to go into public service, he said, you need to be humble. You need to listen to others. If you don't listen and are not humble, your governance will not be good. So therefore, if you want to engage in public service, you need to learn humility. I mean, I thought they should all just stop up there talking and just think about what the Pope has just said. Listening and humility are not things we see as characteristic of what's happening right now up there in the Hill. You want to?
Yeah, going back to what someone said earlier, I read an article a few years ago for a class, and it was just talking about the changes in Congress and government over time, and how most congressmen used to live in DC, and they would get to know each other's families, like spend the weekends with each other. So you have this relationship outside of politics. I think that's where you get work done. You see someone as a friend rather than someone on the other side of the aisle. And now that I think because our system has become so dependent on campaigning, with the 24-hour news cycle, they have to be home campaigning, they have to raise $10,000 a day or more, to be able to get reelected. So the focus is much more on getting reelected rather than governing.
You see vestiges of that. Like, I'm a Little League baseball coach, as I think I've told you. David Gregory's from Meet the Press, his son, is part of Little League, and my son's age, and his kids' team played my son's team on Saturday, so David was there, and we try not to talk shop when we're baseball dads. But Dee Dee Meyer's son was on my team last year, and so Washington D.C. It's all these funny things, like you're doing basketball with your kids, and next to you on the bench is Susan Rice, who's like her daughter plays basketball, so she's playing basketball against my son's team. And so those are wonderful environments in which parents are seeing each other, meeting each other as parents. And, they have just pleasant conversations about, or enthusiastic conversations about basketball or baseball or something else. And you're right, we've lost that sense of a relationship outside of politics.
And you see like small vestiges of it. I mean, I think like Biden during the last debt ceiling talk reached out to, I can't remember if it was McConnell or some Republican, so there's like the older kind of people who've been there for a while have them. But you just don't see that kind of relationship, those relationships.
I work for Meet the Press, so I have a little bit of a perspective on the relationships that I see because I work in a green room. And I would actually have to disagree, and perhaps we're not getting a lot of the newbies on our show necessarily, but pretty much everyone knows everyone, and is staying and talking and congregating long after the show has ended. Sometimes we actually have to kind of force them away because they have relationships, the journalists have relationships with senators and reps and communications people, and Dee Dee was actually here last week. But they're all talking all of the time, and I actually think it's really interesting to see the conversations they have and hear the conversations they have outside of their talking points, because many of them do come with party packaged talking points. Yeah. And that makes me obviously really sad, and we can clearly tell who has their talking points and who doesn't, who's speaking off cuff. But when we actually get to hear them talking naturally about them, I don't know, it's hard because I don't understand how them as people, when they collectively get together and talk without cameras rolling,
it's always better.
They're totally different.
Well, and that's I was in the green room last week doing a show with MSNBC, and David Gregory was there, and Mitch Landrieu, mayor of New Orleans, was there, and Michael Nutter from Philadelphia about violence in the cities. And when that happens, you're exactly right. People tend to react in a more human kind of way. It doesn't happen as much as it needs to, and often it's people at that level meet the press guests. Members of Congress, though, I think a lot of them are just not talking to anybody. What they tell me outside their bubbles, on both sides, they're in their bubbles and not talking to each other. So when you're at a Little League game or you're in the green room, you tend to say, when you talk to people about you got kids? How old are your kids? It's amazing how the conversation just gets going about common stuff you're facing as parents. Yeah, please.
I feel like I don't have your level of access, but from what I've heard in speeches and campaigning, it's almost a point of pride how often members of Congress are back in their home districts. Yeah. They're I'm here every weekend, whenever I can. So I just think that is sad because like whoever brought it up was saying, they really should be getting to know each other outside, and it shouldn't be, I don't think it should be a point of pride that you're not in DC at every available minute.
Yeah.
Actually, I kind of slightly want to disagragree with that, Molly, because I get the idea that you want all your politicians to be civil with each other. But another big problem that has arisen in politics is like this idea of the political elite, where you no longer have politicians of the people, politicians who know their constituents. Because yes, it's one thing to have politicians be baseball coaches together,
Yeah.
but it's another thing to have that politician be a baseball coach in his own district, and to have him know his own people and to
Right.
have those types of conversations with the people that he's representing.
And who might disagree with them.
Yeah, and to be able to get the perspective from people you're representing, I think is actually.
So human contact, no matter where it happens, is a really good thing.
Yeah, and I think.
I think that's true.
I think you have to, yes, you want both,
Yeah.
but it's important to remember that at the end of the day, they are representing their constituents.
Well, let's look at, yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I was just gonna just say one other thing, pick up on something Charlotte said before about things being very black and white. And, in this complex world where everything is a shade of gray,
Right.
ultimately the one set of people who have to make a decision that's a black and white decision are the politicians, because they either have to vote something up or vote something down. So ultimately, they have to decide, which way to go. And I think maybe it's our job to try and take those shades of gray that we all live with and put them in a package that, our politicians can work with.
And given that, it was healthier when in times past, those votes weren't entirely predictable by a partisan ideological line. When you might be voting with your colleagues this week and against them next week, depending on the issue. And that is less and less true. So I'm very encouraged by your responses, which say, we're watching this, hopefully we're learning from this, because we're going to have to do it better, as opposed to let's just not try and get involved in politics because it's hopeless. And that's the fear. People have such cynicism. I don't mean just politics, but public life. You need to engage in public life, whether it's in politics or your professions or vocations. And I think you've got to watch and learn from what you see how you want to do this in a different kind of way. So I'm encouraged by that. Let's take the immigration. Now, let's take immigration, and you've been doing these readings, and we've got next week with Jenny Yang, which you'll love. Let's take it as a case study, okay? A case study of how we might do things better, even do things right. How the movement to reform immigration is being led in large part by the faith community and business, Bibles, badges, business, you read that piece, allies, different sectors, but it's a case study of how faith and politics can interact and work for both the religious community and for the country in a positive way, I'm going to suggest. So consider your readings and look at what has been accomplished. Last Friday we had a meeting of the Evangelical Immigration Table, EIT, and you've read something about that. It was our all-day strategy for the fall, what we can do about trying to push this past the finish line in the fall. So I was asked to do a reflection for the group on where we are and what we've accomplished. So that got me thinking about that, and I thought a lot more about it over the weekend for this class. And so here's what I think we have accomplished. First of all, for the faith community, let's take the Bible, okay? The Bible, yes. Biblical passages from the scriptures are now in the center of a public conversation, which when you think about it, is pretty extraordinary. The study of scriptures by churches last spring, you read about that, even including members of Congress, were a key part of the strategy. And so, as you read, the Hebrew word ger, for foreigner, immigrant, appears 92 times in the Hebrew Scriptures, and people have been studying that and how we're then to treat foreigners today. That's come out of this conversation. Matthew 25, which we have talked about already, is being discussed not only in churches but in congressional offices, which is quite extraordinary. How Christians have been converted to see how we treat the stranger, meaning 11 million undocumented immigrants, is how we treat Christ himself. And the Jewish teaching on this about the other, the stranger, the foreigner, are just treat the exile well because you were exiles. Remember who you are. Treat the exile well because that's who you were. So that conversation in the faith community is changing the political conversation. That is an extraordinary thing. So the Bible is somehow a factor in this debate. Second, prayer. I mean, when you think about this, and Jenny Yang is one of those young activists that I'm really impressed by, and she'll be here next week to talk about it's called Pray for Reform. Pray, the number 4, for reform. Pray for reform. That's this campaign, one of the slogans of it. There are now 150,000 prayer partners, which is a phrase you often hear in the faith community, but these prayer partners are putting their feet to their prayers. They're actually talking with their members of Congress, and they're turning up in the August recess. They just filled town meetings and public halls and discussions with their thoughts. And they're praying this reform into being, and they're telling members of Congress. So you have a meeting. This is really I find this intriguing. They meet with a member of Congress, and members of Congress are used to that. People come with an interest or an agenda, and they meet with them, and then they meet these folks, and at the end, and they say, "Well, I just want you to know that we're praying for you." Member of Congress says, "Oh, okay." Okay, I'm not sure I'm excited about that. I mean, you're going to think about me and focus on me, and you're going to pray for me. And so they're kind of often taken aback by that, or sometimes touched or moved by it. Other times, like, it's two responses. One is like, I feel touched by that, I'm moved by that, supported by that, or that means you're going to be watching me. It's like, both are implied in the same, we're going to be praying for you. So I've been really struck by how that has affected members of Congress. And now I hear people saying, given what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now, something positive and productive seemingly will take a miracle, and that requires prayer. So I hear people talking about this. It's sort of, we have to really go to prayer now because of what's going to fix politics. I'm not sure. So third, Bible and prayer. Third is faith. Faith is actually trumping politics on this issue. I mean, I can tell you stories of members of Congress whose politics would normally make them oppose this. But their own personal faith, or being impressed by the faith of the people who are talking to them, even if they're not people of faith, is changing their minds, trumping their ideologies. And they're joining people on the other side of the aisle. Like, I've met with the Gang of Eight. These are Republicans and Democratic senators. And they're people who are fighting on this other stuff, but there they are together in this conversation. So it's helping bring people together, which is my point number 4. In the churches, people being brought together, and synagogues and mosques, they're being brought together across political lines. People who vote differently on other issues, on this issue, are being brought together, which is very interesting. When we launched this table, it was Sojourners, people expected that. It was also the Southern Baptists, alongside Sojourners. And Jacob will tell you, that seemed like a typo in the press release to a lot of people. Wait, there must be a mistake. It couldn't be Sojourners and the Southern Baptists. The new head of the Southern Baptists, who leads the whole church on this stuff, is Russell Moore. He and I had a 3-hour dinner at Clyde's across the street, Friday night. 3 hours talking about a collaboration, cooperation. He's a new generation. He's 40-something. I think he's terrific. And we're becoming friends, and so we're going to work on lots of stuff. Also in the room are the National Association of Evangelicals. Also in the room are all the Hispanic evangelical leaders, also megachurch pastors like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek, white megachurch pastors. And on the Saturday before our Tuesday press conference, I get a call from Jim Daly, who's the new leader of Focus on the Family. You've heard of James Dobson from Focus on the Family. He was with Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, a real tough political guy on the right. His new predecessor now, he's again 40-something, he had called me up. We've had dinner, we had conversations, and he called, can I join you on the immigration reform? Why? Because, title of the organization, Focus on the Family. They're focusing on families being divided, separated, destroyed by a broken immigration system. The old Focus on the Family were focusing on, I'll be honest, white, suburban, affluent families. They weren't focusing on immigrant families. The new guy, the new organization, is focusing on low-income, immigrant, undocumented families, and that's a focus on the families. They're not becoming left-wing. They're just doing their vocation, focusing on families. But from the press point of view, Sojourners, Southern Baptists, Focus on the Family together, that really changed the whole conversation. This summer we had a big service in D.C. and my job was to close the service. And I looked around, it was packed church, Metropolitan Church, downtown by the Capitol. And I said, our Hispanic brothers and sisters led on this first. They were the ones who led on this for a long time. But now, look around. We're all here. They were there, African American, Anglo, Asian American, everybody was there. We're all here now. We're all in the house. And I said, let's not end the service. Let's move it to the Congress. Move it. And so we did, into 110 congressional offices that day alone, from 27 states. Now that impresses people in the Congress, okay? Also, it's bringing together allies. Again, Bibles, badges of business. Business leaders are saying, this is bad for business. These people are doing work that no one else is doing in the agricultural sector. They're providing services for a service economy, our houses, hotels, all over and they're in the shadows, living in fear. And this is not good for business. Law enforcement people say, I've got more to do with my time than going after law-abiding people who are otherwise obeying the law, but they're undocumented. I've got real criminals and violence out here I've got to deal with, and I've got to spend my time doing this. This isn't working for us as attorneys generals of states and law enforcement. So those three constituencies, evangelicals, law enforcement, and business, have been three Republican constituencies. And now they're saying they want immigration reform, which is only way to explain why I would get a call from Paul Ryan, which I did in July. Said, Jim, I want to help you with immigration reform. Paul Ryan. We disagree on lots of stuff. I've editorialized deliberately in Wisconsin newspapers against his budget. He knows that. But let me help you on immigration. So we had a meeting with him. And he said, you've accomplished something that we've never seen before. On immigration, you've got a grassroots movement that can influence the right and Republicans, as well as Democrats and the left. So bringing people together is what you have to do to change something, right? Strange bedfellows always impress members of Congress. So in bringing them together, I thought it'd be worth, this is the thing that most impressed me when I met with these senators and Democrat Republican, both of them, we had a whole day of this Bibles, badges, business. And in back-to-back meetings, they said the same thing. Here's what they said. They said, let's be honest. Normally, we would handle this issue in ways that would help us win the next election. I'm just being honest. We'd frame this in a way that helped us win and the other side lose. That's what we normally do. But on this one, we're going to promise you we're not going to do that. On this one, we're going to do what it takes to get a bipartisan bill passed on this one. Because you've convinced us we have to protect those 11 million families. We're going to make an exception and do something we don't normally do. I thought that was very significant that they said, here's what we normally do, to be honest. This time we're doing it differently. I was very encouraged by that. And the last thing I'll say is I think, and I want to put all this up for discussion quickly here, I think this has increased even the credibility of the faith community, because so many people look what we say and do and don't say and don't do and just think we're not credible. And so here you've got vulnerable, undocumented people who really are being served by at least many in the faith community. Then a lot of young people who say, this is the right thing to do. This is, you're talking about my roommate, my friend, my dreamer friend who is in college with me and she is undocumented. And you're talking about her future. This is my friend, and you guys are the ones who are, so that makes a lot of young people say, this is actually something that's good that's being done by the faith community. When a lot of things that we do in the faith community, people say, oh, geez. And so this is really increasing the credibility of the faith community, particularly to young people, about the whole idea of faith. So that becomes a big deal. Let me tell you a quick story. When we launched the table in 2012, summer, it was a Tuesday in June, folks, the family had joined us, and Baptists, and so there, Tuesday, we're all standing there. This got great press, Hispanic press and English press. So we had a meeting at the White House that afternoon. They wanted to meet. So they said, we're with you. We're really with you. And I said, well, your heart's in the right place. I believe that. Your heart's in the right place. But you haven't shown any courage on this. The White House has not shown any courage, any leadership on this issue. You really haven't. It's time to show some courage. That was Tuesday afternoon. Friday morning, you normally don't see influence from what you do 3 days later in this town. It takes a long time. So I was surprised. Friday morning, we got this call at 7 a.m. from the White House. They were on this table, their table, and they said, we want to brief you on what the president's going to do today. That was the day he deferred deportation against all the young people who came here before they were 16, saying, well, kids who are 16, they kind of should do what their parents tell them to do. We're going. And they get up and go with their parents. If they came before they were 16 and now gone through college or in the military, they were going to be deferred deportation and given work permits instead. That act on that day, on that Friday, changed the lives of millions of young people. And the White House said, and this is all just with us, the White House, and the cameras, I guess, the White House said they were terrified that day of making this decision. They were terrified. Please get statements out right away supporting this from conservative and liberal leaders, which we did. And then on Sunday, this was so Tuesday, Friday, White House terrified, got statements out. Sunday, I'm getting calls, emails, text messages from churches all over the country with reports of dancing, singing, jumping up and down, clapping hands, arm in arm, Anglo churches, Hispanic churches together, young people, fathers. It was Father's Day. Fathers feeling for the first time in their lives and tears in their eyes, they weren't afraid of their kids getting deported and taken away. It was a joyous Sunday all over the country. Monday they took a poll, public opinion poll, and they found 70% of the American people were in favor of what the president had done on Friday. 70%. But the White House says they wouldn't have done it. Quote, "We would not have done this on Friday if you hadn't did what you did on Tuesday. We wouldn't have done it. They wouldn't have taken the risk." Now, had they taken the risk, they would have had 70% behind them. But they wouldn't take that risk. What they said was, you gave us the space to make that decision, the political space to make that decision. So here's the faith community, evangelicals actually, who gave the White House the space to make that decision, which changed the lives of millions of young people, and politically, in hindsight, brought an enthusiastic Hispanic vote back to Barack Obama, and the Hispanic vote was a big reason why he won the election. Now the White House realizes, by doing that on that Friday, that helps to win the election, and you all sort of helped us to do that. What else could we do? We really had those conversations now in the White House. So the faith community actually created political space and then did that for Republicans too, to do the right thing. So that shows us how change happens. It's never just originally inside Washington, it's always outside. How do you change hearts and minds? Therefore, how do you change a conversation? Then how do you change culture? And only then do you change decisions. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. was changing a culture before we had a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act, changing a culture at great cost. It was a movement, a social movement. So this, again, same thing. It's a movement based in moral convictions and faith beliefs, and it's people who are in this for usually religious or moral. You don't have to be religious, but usually out of some moral sense of something has to change. And that's what's doing in here. So how will it end? Well, we have a good Senate bill. The Senate bill is pretty good. We have these principles of the table. I think you probably read them, but I'll just repeat them here. So these were our principles. We just sent them to the House we're sending it this week to the House. Our principles: respects the God-given dignity of that a law has to pass, respects the God-given dignity of every person, protects the unity of the immediate family, respects the rule of law, guarantees secure national borders, ensures fairness to taxpayers, and establishes a path toward legal status and/or citizenship for those who qualify and who wish to become permanent residents. Those principles sent to the Senate. They go to the House, I think, this week sometime. And how will it end? Senate bill, the House passes anything at all, even board security, it's got to go to a conference committee. And then a new bill will come out of the conference and be voted on by the House and the Senate. So in one of the things that you read, we talked about the urgencies that we're feeling, why we don't really think we can wait until until the politics can figure this out down the road. And the urgencies are just like the urgencies of the families who are being broken up. All the kids in foster care, parents being separated. There's a serious family crisis here. The urgencies of people who are in the shadows and unprotected. I mean, pastors have told stories to members of Congress. I love being in a room with a member of Congress who, in their constituency, a pastor is saying from their district, I know people who can't get health care. When they're injured, they can't go to the doctor. They're afraid of being deported. And they literally go off in a corner and curl up and hope they don't die. I know women that have been raped and can't get the help that they need or protection. Immigrants are walking ATM machines on payday because anybody can go after them, no protection, and take their money away. Pastors telling stories to members of Congress. The urgency of the agricultural industry, and I know many of the farms, they're about to collapse because they don't have the workers that they need. They can't find the workers they need because they're all illegal. There's a particular farm that I'm very close to out in the Northwest, biggest apple farm in the Northwest. And this actually place is run by a couple, totally, you know, middle-class couple, 2 kids. He was in court for driving too fast. She was in court Sunday for driving too slow. And they met in court. And they started dating and they got married. And they're a Christian couple, and this guy is just incredibly good at growing apples. I don't know why, but he just has this. And she is an incredible activist. And they make millions of dollars, and they literally give it all away. Haiti, they gave more in Haiti than Walmart did. This is a farm in the Northwest. Africa famine, they give $1 million to World Vision. They just give their money. They give 90% of their profits away. They build houses for their workers. They built a school for their workers, schools, all through 3 levels. They build a little church for Catholics, evangelical, whoever wants to go, stores. They don't want their workers' children to work for them. They want them to go to college. They provide scholarships for their workers' kids to go to college. Okay? ICE just came down to enforce the law against them and told them they have to fire all their workers because they're undocumented. It makes, now they're an exemplary employer. They're not all like my friends. But ICE came in, just didn't pick on them, just threw out the net and found them. This is an utterly broken system. This farm is crucial to the whole community around it. Most of the kids in the public high school are from the farm. Right? The school was shut down. The system's totally broken. Right? I've held those kids in my lap, you know, out there in the farm. They're just, you know, and you hear stories. Father got sent away, deported. Little girl goes to the door every day at 5 o'clock when her dad used to come home. She still goes every day at 5 o'clock, hoping her dad will come home, you know. So when you tell these stories to members of Congress, it finally makes a difference. So urgencies. We won the recess, won the conversation. Will the public opinion win in America against a small minority who are holding out for government to be hostage to their agenda? That's what hits me today, is those kids on that farm and those families who are just breathlessly waiting for this law to pass. They're just waiting. And they see Washington happening, and they're going to be just so fearful and so discouraged. So, and I wish I could tell you what I think is going to happen, because nobody knows. I mean, members of Congress don't know. Chuck Todd doesn't know. David Gregory doesn't know. I mean, meet the press. Nobody knows. So we'll be watching in these next few days. But my point is here that immigration, this story, our topic today and next week, turns out to be a wonderful case study of how things could work if we allowed things to happen like that, and the role of the faith. We didn't do it by ourselves at all, but a catalytic role from the faith community can be a real part of the progress in making something happen.